Good afternoon, everyone. It's really hard to say that, even though it's 5 o'clock, but it's like dark out. So it really feels like evening. But we'll call it afternoon. Just, can someone let whoever's knocking? Thanks, all of you, for coming out tonight. I want to welcome you to part 2 of the Tocqueville Center's November event. My name is Brent Nelson, and I am the interim director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society, and a professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. The Tocqueville Center is dedicated to exploring big questions about democracy and modern society. We ask questions because Tocqueville asked them. Alexis de Tocqueville was a 19th century French aristocrat, social scientist, philosopher, and politician. He wrote a great book in the 1830s called Democracy in America that is still relevant in today's world. The book is a kind of microscope that magnifies the little things about American society that turn out to be essential to understanding the nature of democracy, not just in North America, but in fact in the world. Tocqueville was like the 17th century physicians who turned the microscope on the human body and discovered red blood cells, a key to life. He traveled America and observed equality, individualism, and civic associations, keys to modern society. This year, the Tocqueville Center is honoring the legacy of its namesake by focusing on topics in which Tocqueville was particularly interested. This month, we are examining the Black experience in America, which Tocqueville had much to say about in his book written 30 years before the end of slavery. He looked on the America of the 1830s. He could see in the distance the elimination of slavery, but he could also see the pernicious effects of racialized servitude. He wrote perceptively, "The law can abolish servitude, but only God can obliterate its traces. I see that slavery is in retreat, but the prejudice from which it arose is immovable." Tocqueville might still recognize race relations in 21st century America. We live in an America where slavery's traces are still visible and prejudice remains immovable. That is what we have been exploring these past 2 days. Before I introduce the speakers for the evening, let me first draw your attention to Furman's Standards of Comportment, printed above. And now to the main event. Tonight we will hear from 2 speakers, Professors Monica Bell and Andra Gillespie. And due to travel issues yesterday, we swapped Professors Bell and Professor Brown. And so if you saw like a slightly different lineup, that's because of what happened yesterday. But 2 great speakers today. We will then add several more people to the stage for a panel discussion of the presentations, which will be followed by an audience Q&A. So let me introduce our 2 speakers, and they will come up in this order and go without introduction after we start. Monica Bell is Professor of Law and Counselor to the Dean at Yale Law School and Associate Professor of Sociology at Yale University. She was born and raised in Anderson, South Carolina, and attended Furman University, someplace you might know, where she graduated in 2003. She won a Truman Scholarship and went on from Furman to earn her M.Sc. at University College Dublin, her J.D. at Yale Law School, and her Ph.D. at Harvard University. Between law school and graduate school, Professor Bell clerked for the Honorable Cameron McGowan Currie of the U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina, and served as Arthur Lyman Fellow at the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia, where her work focused largely on TANF legislation and child support regulation. Professor Bell was the first Black woman to serve as a tenure-track member of the Yale Law School junior faculty and is the second Black woman to receive tenure there. Professor Bell's recent scholarship is focused on policing and legal estrangement, race and spatial injustice, law and poverty, and trust in legal authorities. In addition to publication in the most prestigious journals in her field, Professor Bell has also pursued a career as a public intellectual by writing for popular outlets such as Politico, Inquest, and the Washington Post. The second speaker today is Andra Gillespie, and she is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. She earned a BA from the University of Virginia and an MA, MPhil, and Ph.D. from Yale. She is the author of or editor of 3 books, Race and the Obama Administration, Substance, Symbols, and Hope, The New Black Politician, Cory Booker, Newark and Post-Racial America, and Who's Black Politics? Cases in Post-Racial Black Leadership. Professor Gillespie is also a prolific columnist. Her many opinion pieces have appeared in newspapers and other publications across the country. Welcome to Professor Monica Bell to the podium.
I've heard stories about people who have lost their children. I was in high school. They would say, so-and-so got our kids taken because our house was too dirty. I was scared to death. I've heard of people that if your house isn't clean and they come in there and your house is really filthy, they would take your kids. How filthy do your house have to be? I'm not the neatest person. My house is comfortable. How dirty does your house have to be for them to take your kids? When they said dirty, what do they mean? When I look at hoarders, I don't know if you know hoarders, I was thinking, this must be what they mean? Because I would think if they saw a pile of dirty clothes or whatever, I wouldn't think they would say, I'm going to take your daughter. How dirty does your house have to be? So, first of all, I just want to take a second to thank Dr. Nelson and Dr. Guth for inviting me here. I want to send a special thanks to Lucy Southwell for all of her intrepid organizing work, and really for all of the people who have collaborated to make it possible for us to be here. I'm really, really grateful always to come back to Furman. Coming home is wonderful. The poem I just read is an excerpt from a larger project that I'm working on, where I'm trying to revisit interviews I've done in the past with low-income Black mothers who live in Washington, D.C., to shed light on their experiences with legal authorities in a way that I hope will be emotionally resonant. I want to say a little bit more about that. What are the puzzles that have motivated this project? One of them is empirical. So I've been deeply interested for a very long time about how Black mothers, and especially people who living at intersectional margins, including poverty, experience legal authority at many points in their lives and along various system trajectories. That's a very big question, not a great research question, not a narrow enough one. But really what I'm interested in, also in this project, this poetic project, is how I can convey the complexity, ambivalence, and emotional immediacy of this set of experiences. So what I'm going to try to do in this short period of time is interweave some of the poems and with some larger kind of theoretical and topical discussions that I hope will be illuminating a little bit more about the data and methods of the project. And you may or may not be able to see anything actually in this chart, but there are a couple of points I want to highlight. So the project is based on 50 in-depth semi-structured interviews. So the tentative title of the collection is 50 Mothers, with the goal of actually being able to tell stories from all of the interview respondents in the final product. And I'd be happy to talk about that kind of stuff more in Q&A. I conducted these interviews in Washington, D.C., where I had been a legal aid attorney a couple of years before I started conducting the interviews, in a place that I really love. The two things I want to point out here that are relevant, actually, I'll just be one. I'll focus on one for the purpose of time. In this chart, just based on what people were telling me in the context of interviews, more than half of the mothers I interviewed told me they had been investigated by Child Protective Services, or the family, the kind of Child and Family Services Agency is what it's called in DC. And I mention this because I was not sampling for this. There was no specific effort to find people who had been part of that system or had been investigated. But as I hope you saw in the first poem, this is a very rational fear, this concern that you will somehow get deeply system involved. I need to move on because of time. I want to read the second piece. I was spoiled until I lost my mother. I was 27. I lost my mother. A month later, I lost my kids. They was called on me. They was called on me, and my kids was taken. My aunt did it. I shut down. When they took my kids, I started giving up on life, withdrawn, selling drugs, doing drugs. It took me on a downfall. Have you forgiven your aunt? In the last 5 years, I have. At first, I couldn't. It made my kids hard. They was out in my life. I was seeing them, but I didn't have them. Right now, I'm working on a relationship with my oldest. She's disrespectful. She called me a bitch, told me I was dead to her. Right now, I'm working on a relationship with my middle. I don't know where she's at. I have one brother, but I don't have him. I just lost him too. How long ago? To be honest, I don't want to know. I can't remember. I've been losing so many people. I try not to remember. I just lost my father the other night. I try not to remember. Since I lost my father, my mind is it's been drifting. Because I've been losing people so much. I feel so numb. Right now, I don't know what to feel. So what you might pick up a bit from that poem is, there are many pieces. One, the consistency of loss, this deep sense of loss, specific to the child welfare system, which is where I'm focusing today. She sees her involvement with the child welfare system, which she's not even actually saying was totally unjustified, but that involvement really set her on a spiral of this constant loss and an inability to repair it. And so when we think about what the consequences of law are for people, for experience with legal authority, this type of deep experience resulting in this kind of emotional numbness, those are the types of emotional experiences I hope to elevate in this project. So I wanted to say a word more broadly about the policing and surveillance in Black low-income families. So as Dr. Nelson mentioned, I spent a lot of time writing and thinking about policing. Most of that work has been on municipal policing. So this first little bubble up here is what people think of when they think about police. But police are everywhere. And especially if you think about precisely about the experiences of Black Americans, especially in urban areas, and especially living under conditions of economic marginality, there's quite pervasive policing. So here I highlight university policing, which I feel a special responsibility to mention as a member of the Yale University faculty. Yale was actually the first university to have a police department. And it is remarkable how those multiple layers of policing in a quite economically unequal and racially diverse town like New Haven has a lot of consequences for the people of New Haven, especially Black low-income people in New Haven. housing police. Lots of public housing has its own police force or have special kind of envoys from the municipal police department to work there. Transit police, school police, healthcare policing in hospitals and in the VA. Private policing is really important, and I really would love to go on and on about all these different forms of policing. In the interest of time, I won't, but I just wanted to highlight that what I'm doing this talk is discussing family policing. And the stand-in there, the relevant agencies there are child welfare agencies or child protective services agencies, which we often think of, and I thought of here when I was a student here, as like doing really good, wholesome, helpful work. And that may be true in certain instances, but there are also consequences of this type of policing, especially when you consider the disproportionality of it. So some of the people who have really influenced my own thinking and my evolution of thinking about the child welfare system and its role in our broader system of governing and surveilling Black Americans today are people like Kiara Bridges, who wrote a great book called The Poverty of Privacy Rights, in which she essentially argues that low-income Black women don't have privacy rights. So, we have a lot of debate right now about what the law will be around privacy law. We've seen that play out at the Supreme Court, especially over the last couple of years. But Bridges basically argues that this is an irrelevant discussion to low-income Black women because of our focus on surveilling them. Second, a very recent book, like really just out maybe a month ago, is Kelly Fong's Investigating Families, Motherhood in the Shadow of Child Protective Services. I won't go on and on about that book yet, but it is really exciting and it's very new. I also want to highlight not just this book by Dorothy Roberts, Torn Apart is the most recent book released in 2022, but she has a large body of work over the course of a decade, more than a decade, discussing child protective services and how it fits into a particular form of racial oppression. And in this book, Torn Apart, she argues for the abolition of what she calls family policing, and what some people call family surveillance, or et cetera. But these are some of the works that I think are important to highlight. Another piece. If I told somebody about her father picking her up and throwing her back down, they might go back and tell somebody in social services. They might misinterpret that as something that happened recently. That was something that happened when she was 5 months old. She's 5 years old now. They would misinterpret. Then I'd have cops at my house. I'm trying to convince them that it happened at blah, blah, blah. They're not listening. They probably wouldn't listen to me because of the situation that I'm in. Welfare, public housing. I don't think they would believe me. They would look at me in disbelief. I don't think they would believe me. They wouldn't believe me. I know one lady, she had gotten arrested for something that happened to her years ago. It cost her a job, it cost her headaches, an arrest that had nothing to do with the present. You be careful about who you're telling this stuff to. They can go back and tell on you. Some of the key elements I think that are important to highlight in this piece are this sense that being someone who is a Black mother, who is poor, who lives in public housing, who receives TANF, which is a very small amount of money in post-1996. All of these conditions come together, in her eyes, to make her totally unbelievable and incredible in the eyes of the state. Her experience of surveillance is one of being an untrustworthy source. And so this is important to highlight. Another piece I wanted to highlight here is the sense that you have to really be careful who you talk to about anything in your life, because someone can go back and tell on you, which is an interesting thing to hear from someone who is a full adult, right? You're worried about someone tattling. And I think this brings to mind a concept that I teach about in the context of the criminal justice system, the concept of the panopticon. I'm curious whether anyone has heard of this term here. Yeah. So, okay, great. Ooh, yay. So I want to ask you, what is the panopticon? Yeah, you with your hand raised.
I think it was created by Bentham. It's like a prison system where there's someone in the middle, and they can see everyone that's in the prison system, but the people inside the prison cannot see outside.
Right, yeah. And so what is the purpose of the panopticon? You had your hand raised, you know?
It's just constant observance and surveillance.
Yeah. Is constant observance and surveillance. And this is the design that Bentham came up with. I think, while designed by Bentham, some of the most popular critique of the panopticon model and contextualization of it has been by Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, as well as much more recently, Angela Davis in Our Prisons Obsolete, which she argues for prison abolition. And so important features are not just the design. There's also this point that, the people who are in the panopticon, they're being watched kind of constantly, but the real purpose on some level is to discipline people so that they will police themselves and govern themselves in a particular sort of way. So there is a psychological effect. So even if you're not being watched at that moment, one is to govern themselves like they're constantly being watched. I also am thinking about the work here of Simone Brown, in Dark Matters, where she builds off of this concept of the panopticon and the critique of the panopticon by Foucault to discuss the slave ship as another form, a version of panopticon that really draws into mind why this is a specific problem in terms of racial organization in the United States. And so she revisits the diagram of the Brooks slave ship, which sailed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, 11 voyages during the Middle Passage to bring enslaved Black people to the Americas. So she revisits this to basically say, this is a panopticon as well. And the purpose of that panopticon was specifically racial oppression. So there's a way in which the idea of the panopticon was meant to be reformist. Like, though actually, it's like, well, you know that you're being watched, therefore you will discipline yourself in a certain way. And so that could be good theoretically. But what we do know is that this version of the panopticon was, in very intense, serious ways, a font of our ongoing racial oppression. I'm gonna read another piece now. Well, my name is such and such, and I'm coming here from CPS. We got a report of neglect. Neglect of who? I don't neglect my kids. Y'all got the wrong person. Oh my God, just leave me alone. Oh my God, what could he want? What did I do? This boy called CPS on me, this random boy. I wouldn't talk to him. He used to walk past with a little smirk on his face, laughing and stuff. I was like, I bet you he called on me, and he called. The man had come to my house, to the kids' school. He was like, someone called. I asked, tell me if it was a male or female. He told me it wasn't a female. The man came and went to the kids' school. He talked to the teachers. He talked to the principal. He talked to the kids. He came to my house, got to see the house. He said it was no compliance with what the person had said. He was sorry, but he gave me a referral. I went to get furniture. They paid for my whole place. I got furniture there, the living room, dining room, bedroom. Everybody got new everything. We had to go to a center. We give them a little paper. They give us clothes and everything. We got all new furniture. Even though it was bad that he called, it benefited us in the long run. I don't know. So part of the mission behind this poetic project is to be able to introduce in a succinct way the complexity of experiences with the systems of surveillance, like the family policing system. So we see here in this piece that the speaker is totally aggrieved and totally angry about this nonsense thing happening to her. But she points out that there is some material benefit, because what we do know is that most of the family policing that happens, again, particularly in the context of Black and low-income people, is because of poverty. It's is your refrigerator full? Do you have furniture in your house? Do you have enough? And so basically when this worker came, he saw, oh, they could have better things. And so there was a material benefit for her in this. What I'm trying to do in the project is to code the data on two different levels. One is an empirical form of coding that we talk about in terms of qualitative methods, interview-based methods, where you're coding for things. And as I showed you at the very beginning of the presentation, it is clear that a strong theme of this project is the pervasiveness of experiences with family policing among this group. And I'll even point out that the speaker in the Dirty House poem had never been investigated by Child Protective Services. She was part of the minority of the 48%. She was just worried about it. So when we actually think about the pervasiveness of the influence of ways people think about their lives is quite strong. I'm also in the project trying to engage in what I call poetic coding, which is coding for the story, for the narrative, but also coding for things like unexpected perspectives, coding for internal contradiction, pointing out that things can be bad and have benefits at the same time. I think those types of complexities allow us to have more nuanced conversations about many, many different forms of policing and their pluses and minuses. The final piece I want to read is from Pam. I actually called child services myself for my son. I realized I was an addict and needed help. I got evicted from my apartment. That was when I felt like I had hit bottom. I called them. I let them know me and my son had been evicted. I didn't want him to be out on the streets. The importance of this piece is to, again, highlight some bits of complexity. So I will say in all of my reading and research about family policing and about policing more broadly, I've never come across, in my understanding, people affirmatively calling Child Protective Services on themselves. This is not a usual thing. This is not something I would feel comfortable elevating in a straightforward empirical piece about the family policing system. But what we learn from this experience is about desperation and the lack of resources. So in the ideal, if people realize they have a problem and they need help, they wouldn't call a system that would take their kid away. They would call a system that would help them be able to care for their child more effectively. They would call a system, inquire about a system that would help them get clean so they could be a better parent. But all Pam felt like she had was a system that did in fact take her child away. And he had a whole bunch of other problems that time prevented me from getting into. But I just want to say a quick word to close about the theory of change of this project. Like, why would a law professor who has primarily written about things you can change in law and policy think about poetic representation of Black low-income women's narratives as being part of the same bundle of goods? And I will say, especially since 2020, I've been thinking a lot about narrative change and how it fits into our capacities and ability to create changes in law and policy. And so I've really been inspired, especially by the work of Audre Lorde and her essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, which I will not read to you in the interest of time, but there are a couple of things I just want to quickly highlight in the piece that I hope will be helpful. So you may have noticed, these are not poems that rhyme. They're really poems, they're free verse, they have a narrative purpose to make stories clear. And the point, as Audre Lorde says, poetry isn't a luxury. It's not about wordplay. It's really about being able to, it's about poetry as the revelation or distillation of experience. And I'm hoping this project speaks to that. The way that connects to change is, I don't know if we really need a bunch of new ideas or new theories, like things that I've written about, to create change. I think it's helpful. But also, and I'll just read this yellow highlighted part to close, within structures defined by profit, by linear power, by institutional dehumanization, our feelings were not meant to survive. Kept around as unavoidable adjuncts or pleasant pastimes, feelings were meant to kneel to thought as we were meant to kneel to men. but women have survived as poets. One of the things I hope to do in this project is to elevate the resilience, the feelings, the emotional experience of legal oppression as a way to help us creatively think more about how to address it. I'll stop there, but thank you for your time.
Well, thank you all for the invitation to be here. It's been a wonderful couple of days. So I too want to thank Drs. Nelson and Dr. Guth. I want to thank the staff of the Tocqueville Center and the Department of Politics. And I want to thank my co-panelists who I've enjoyed listening to. And I've certainly been influenced by the things that I've heard today and hopefully incorporated some of those into my comments. So I want to talk about how we define racism and what that means, especially as we're trying to figure out how to combat it today. So I'm going to preview what I'm going to talk about in my brief remarks. The point I want to make is that the long civil rights movement of the 20th century was a victim of its own success. And so as a result, there are consequences for our politics today that we can see manifest themselves in public opinion and actually even in extant debates about politics and what to do about race. And related to that, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that people's experiences with race, which are clearly informed by their positionality, depending on whether or not they're part of a privileged or dominant group or a marginalized or subordinate group, predict their perceptions of racism and their policy preferences on important racial issues. And so I'll demonstrate this proof of concept throughout my talk. So I want to go back. I know I'm the political scientist on the panel, not a sociologist, but I pay attention to what sociologists have had to say about the rise and fall of social movements, and have certainly been influenced by Doug McAdams' political process model that looks at how the long civil rights movement rose and then what its decline was about. And so Black people have had reason to organize and fight for their rights and to demand full citizenship rights since they've been in the United States. But the big question that sociologists were pondering in the 70s and 80s was why the post-World War II era. And Doug McAdams creates this really persuasive model that says it's not just wanting change, because everybody wants change, but there have to be a confluence of economic, structural, and political conditions that actually help to facilitate a movement being creative and actually being successful at a particular time. So if we look at the pre-World War II era, there were things that were going to keep Blacks kind of in place and were going to make it difficult for a social movement to be able to be successful, though people were talking about and organizing it. So we could talk about the constraints of Blacks being tied to the land through debt peonage. It's something that we talked about over the course of the last couple of days. We could talk about the demands for labor that actually required lots of cheap labor in order to maintain a particular economic system that thrived on not paying people a just wage for their work. We could look at structural institutions where Black organizations were either nascent and barely existent, or in some instances too dependent on whites to be able to be fully independent, and where the leadership actually was more beholden to whites than they were to the grassroots Black communities which they were serving. And then we can think about the post-Reconstruction era and the nadir of African American history, and also what that meant for the disenfranchisement of African Americans. And so if we look at the high watermarks of Black political participation of Black men in and the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, we see a period of regress that starts with the Compromise of 1877 and is then going to carry us into the 20th century, with Southern states disenfranchising Blacks by figuring out racially neutral ways to subvert the 15th Amendment. These things start to change in the movement era. So whether we're looking at the collapse of the cotton economy here in the South in the 1930s, which actually frees up excess labor, and so thus we end up seeing less of the need to maintain and enforce laws that were going to keep Blacks tied to the land and actually discourage Blacks from seeking employment outside of the South, to thinking about the impact of the Great Migration. And it's not just a Great Migration of Blacks from the South to the north and the west. It's also a migration of blacks from rural areas to urban areas and places where you're going to see denser populations, where people are going to be more likely to have higher paying jobs. And so, to move from being an agricultural worker to a domestic worker in a city is going to provide a certain increase in status, a certain increase in income. It's going to allow people to be able to send their children to school longer and perhaps to colleges, historically black colleges and universities that are going to provide the foot soldiers for the civil rights movement. It's going to create more stable church environments where you have preachers who are no longer bivocational, who can now spend their full time being paid by their congregations and thus can stand up to white political power structures. And their houses might be bombed, but they didn't have to worry about losing their jobs as a result of it. And so that actually ends up opening people's tongues, and after they're being pushed by their congregations, makes them vocal leaders in the civil rights movement. And then we can think about political conditions. So as blacks are moving outside of the South to find jobs elsewhere, they are moving to places where disenfranchisement isn't being so strictly enforced. And so while you have the solid democratic South where blacks are disenfranchised, you also see a national Democratic Party that is reaching out to African Americans, trying to expand their footprint so that they can be competitive nationally. In states that we may not think about today as being particularly electorally competitive, were states that actually were the battleground states of the post-World War II era. When we think about sort of how the civil rights movement declines, we can look at how some of those changes in these realms actually end up kind of fomenting a decline of the movement in the late 1960s and 1970s. So if economic conditions freed blacks and made them more mobile, then deindustrialization, which was starting as blacks were moving to the north and west, is actually also going to end up making it difficult for blacks to, one, continue to improve their social status at the same pace that they were improving it in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, even though we're going to see this substantial increase in the black middle class from the 1960s to the 1990s. We're going to see within the civil rights movement debates about integration, debates about black nationalism, debates about the use of armed resistance, and these types of debates are important debates that are important to note within the history of the civil rights movement, but there are also consequences for them as well. It's going to make civil rights organizations less attractive philanthropic targets. And during this period, as the civil rights movement is gaining momentum and as it is achieving narrow but key legislative victories, there are people who think, well, the civil rights movement achieved its goals, it's time to move on to the next cause. So by the late 1960s, we're seeing competition between the civil rights movement, second wave feminism, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement for funding, and other types of things. These things are actually going to end up contributing to a sober lesson of the civil rights movement. I don't want to discount the importance of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. These are landmark pieces of legislation. The reason why we are upset by the changes that the Supreme Court has essentially made to the Voting Rights Act is because these were such landmark pieces of legislation that paved the way for an exponential increase in the number of black elected officials in the United States, paved the way for the election of Barack Obama, certainly paved the way for anti-discrimination to be used to allow blacks to start, not to fully integrate, but to start to integrate the professional occupations and other types of things. But what we learned from the civil rights movement is you can get laws passed and that's not going to achieve full equality. And so the lesson that we learned from the civil rights movement is that there are multiple types of equality, and sometimes organizing around legislative change is only going to achieve part of those changes. So here I'm drawing on the work of Louis Hartz and Roger Smith to note that there are different types of equality. So we have political equality. So this is the stuff that on paper says that everybody is equal. So the first step of that was getting constitutional amendments like the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. And then when legislatures proved adept at figuring out how to get around actually implementing and enforcing those constitutional amendments to provide blacks full citizenship, then the passage of landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act actually helped to make these constitutional promises a reality for many African Americans. But what the civil rights movement made it harder to achieve, and I think this goes to Tocqueville's comment, is that getting legal equality on paper doesn't necessarily ensure that you have social equality or that you achieve economic equality. And so the big lesson of the civil rights movement was that you could achieve political equality and not necessarily provide for social harmony for people, nor did it necessarily change the playing field economically, so that in a capitalist system such as ours, the only reason why we might see economic inequality has to do with individual characteristics and merit and not descriptive characteristics like race. The challenge and the puzzle that we have here today is that this is not evident to most Americans. And so many people see the success of the 1960s as the end and the high water mark of our striving for civil rights. So I want to point out today, Dr. Brown did some of this last night, so I'm just going to piggyback off of some of the things that he did before, is to point out that race still predicts individuals' perspectives on racial issues, because lived experience is different depending on one's racial background, on average. I know this isn't true for everybody, but on average, this is definitely going to be true. So this chart is from the Pew Research Center, and it's looking at people's attitudes about race and perceptions of whether or not race relations are generally good in the United States. And it goes from the 1990s through almost the end of the last decade. And one of the things that you can see is that at racial flashpoints in the United States, like the LA riots or Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, Missouri, right? You see people saying race relations are generally bad, right? It goes down. And then there are also high water marks where people are optimistic about race relations. So if we look at the election of the first Black president, we see that more Americans are saying, hey, race relations are generally good in the United States. So I want you to notice those fluctuations that are situational, but I also want you to notice the gaps between blacks and whites. So in general, whites tend to be more optimistic about race relations than blacks are. And that's a positional sort of perspective, right? Blacks have reason to know from sort of their lived experience and the history of discrimination in the United States that America's not equal, and so they're more likely to report that in public opinion surveys. Right? So the data that I just showed you from Pew ends in 2017, right? This becomes more acute as we see racial flashpoints emerge during the Trump administration and even beyond. So in 2020, after George Floyd was murdered, the Gallup went back and the Associated Press went back and looked at and asked questions about perceptions of race relations. And they can compare those questions to when they asked these questions in a previous era. So if we look at 2015, this is kind of in the post-Ferguson era, what we see is that there's even more pessimism and that there are racial differences. So between 2015 and 2020, more blacks thought that police violence was a problem in the United States. So they had just experienced this in 2014 with the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and then after George Floyd, we see that that's even more acute. But also note the racial differences. So even by 2020, though, we see more whites acknowledging that policing is a problem from a race perspective in the United States. The gap between black and white is huge, right? And so that's a perspective that could be born out of the likelihood or the perception that people who are African American are more mindful of this because they are more likely to be in a situation that George Floyd was in. If we also ask the question about the perception of whether or not police are more likely to use deadly force against a black person, what we find here in this poll is that it changes from 2015 to 2020. So everybody is more likely to say that police are more likely to use deadly force against a black person. But there was near unanimity among blacks to begin with over this time period, so the change is relatively small. We see a bigger change among whites, but again, whites still significantly lag blacks in terms of their perceptions that deadly force is more likely to be used against a black person even after we all witnessed George Floyd's murder. And these things persist over time. So this is Gallup data from 2022, where the Gallup company asks respondents to indicate whether or not you need massive changes or minor changes in order to improve policing. And so one of the things that you'll see here is that there are racial differences where blacks are 20 and 30 percentage points more likely than Hispanic and whites to say that you need major changes in order to improve policing as opposed to minor tweaks. And then if we look at some of these perceptions over time, Gallup asked questions about people's confidence in police, and those who were most pessimistic and least confident about the police consistently over the last 3 years have been African American adults who are, by substantial margins, less likely to say that they have trust in the police. So I would argue that the reason why we see these differences relates to how we define racism. And so there are different ways to define racism. There's the interpersonal way that really is kind of born out of personal prejudice towards people who are members of outgroups. And then there are structural issues. So if we had to define what's the difference between interpersonal racism versus structural racism, what I'm talking about here is the idea that one group is biologically superior or inferior to other groups, right? These are interpersonal types of attitudes. We could use examples like it's okay to use racial slurs about other groups. People who would endorse segregation, separation of the races, and maybe even acceptance of racial violence. You could sometimes call this kind of classic racism, as some sociologists would describe it. And then there's structural issues. And so I'm defining structural issues here as people who would support policies that on their face don't talk about race. So things that might not explicitly mention race, but actually can be shown to have disproportionately and negative effects on people of color. So to explore this a little bit more, to see if there are differences and then to see what some of the consequences are, I'm going to go back to a data set I haven't paid attention to in a long time, but I dusted off for this particular talk. So I'm going to use data that I collected in that wake of the 2016 election. So through my center, I ran an online survey of respondents on November 7th and 8th, so this is around Election Day 2016. I have almost 3,200 respondents in it. This was an all-English sample. I had, or I requested oversamples of minority Republicans, millennials, and white evangelicals. I have things broken down here demographically because I'm not weighting here. So future iterations of this will show kind of a weight so that I can weight it to population demos in the United States. The reason why I'm using this data set is because this survey included questions to ask about whether or not something was racist. So I somehow think about this in sort of the Jeff Foxworthy kind of way. You might be a racist if you do or believe or ascribe to this. And so I include measures of interpersonal racism. And so I ask people whether or not it is racist to use racial slurs, like the N-word. Or is it racist to segregate public facilities? Or is it racist to deny someone service in a store because of their race? And finally, is it okay to physically attack somebody because of their race? I also included some other measures. And so I'm including 6 of those measures here about things that could evidence structural types of racism. And so I take care here to include things that don't specifically talk about race, but that many people who study this would recognize as being things that are going to disproportionately and adversely affect people of color, particularly blacks. So, for instance, is it racist to require photo identification to vote? This has been a huge controversy in the United States for the last almost 20 years. Is it racist to not provide public transit from inner cities to suburbs? So I'm using coded language here, right? I want to see if people identify this as being racist. Is it okay to have food deserts? So to not have grocery stores in close proximity to urban communities. Because it was 2016, and because Donald Trump sort of came into the political sphere by questioning Barack Obama's citizenship, I include a question about whether it is racist if you question where Barack Obama was really born. And then because this was actually coming on the heels of the Flint water crisis, I include a question about environmental racism to ask whether or not people consider it racist if there are decisions that are being made which actually end up raising lead levels in water in urban communities. And then I also ask another question about environmental racism in terms of including landfills in poor communities, just to see if people will identify these as being racist. And so what I do with those questions is I create these additive indices. And so in the questions, if you say that this is definitely or probably racist, I could choose one, then I add it all together. And what I have to record here are sort of basically a histogram of the responses of how people answer these questions. And so this is broken down by race here. And so one of the things that you can see is on the more interpersonal, sort of more classic racism side, most people can identify that these activities are racist. So these are things that history has taught us are bad, and most people know that to be socially acceptable, you don't endorse those as acceptable types of activities. And so we see that that's the case across all of the four largest racial groups that are included in the sample. Blacks are a little bit more likely to identify these things as racist, but you can sort of see the skew there to see that almost everybody sort of recognizes that these things are racist. All right, this looks a little bit different when we break this down and start talking about structural forms of racism. And so it is not the case here that African Americans are more likely to identify structural racism, but what we don't see here is that skew of people not identifying any of the items as racist. So that's more prevalent in the modal response amongst whites, amongst Latinos, amongst Asian Americans, is to not identify any of those structural questions as being racist. We have a more bimodal distribution amongst African Americans. You either saw it or you were more likely to identify all of those things as being racist. All right. And then if we apply these to particular activities, I did ask some policy questions, so I'm going to include 3 here. So the question here, and again I'm going to code this on a binary, is do you support the creation of a border wall? So one of Donald Trump's key campaign promises, right? Do you believe that police treat blacks and whites equally? So again, if you believe that one, so these two are coded conservatively. And then this is the more liberal one, do you support police body cameras? And so this is something that became increasingly relevant after we saw high-profile shootings of unarmed black people and then sort of the contestation over who did what when. And so if we look at this by the interpersonal racism index, one of the things that you'll see is it doesn't matter whether or not the policy would be considered racially liberal or racially conservative. People tended, if they sort of scored high on the interpersonal racism scale, were more likely to support those conservative policies that Donald Trump was espousing, to not believe that blacks and whites were treated differently by the police, but they were also more likely to support body cameras. And so what I'm going to argue here is that understanding and being able to identify interpersonal racism really doesn't predict people's policy attitudes on these types of issues. When I look at structural racism, though, right, we can see differences. So what we see here is that those who tended to not be able to identify structural racism were also the ones who were more likely to support the border wall, and also more likely to believe that blacks and whites were treated equally by the police. In contrast, we see more heterogeneity amongst those who identify structural racism in terms of their support for police body cams. So I'm going to take these cross tabulations for all intents and purposes and include them in logistic regressions. And so I'm just going to go through some of the basic findings that we see here. So the basic takeaway here is that I already thought that the descriptive data already showed that the interpersonal measure didn't predict anything, so I excluded here, and I used the structural racism index. So the higher you score on the structural racism index, and by the way, ORs are odds ratios for those of you who are looking at log odds there. The higher you score on the structural racism barrier, so for every sort of question that you can answer sort of correctly, right, you are less likely to support the implementation of a border wall. You are less likely to believe that police treat blacks and whites equally, but you are more likely to support police body cams. Now, this sort of is a great finding, but I also want to be remiss. When I control for partisanship, party is also a really strong predictor of what's going on here as well. So if we look at Democrats are less likely to support the border wall, not surprising. They're also less likely to perceive that police treat black and white people equally, and they're more likely to support body cams, whereas if you are a Republican, you are more likely to support a border wall, more likely to think that police treat blacks and whites equally, and you're also more likely to support body cams. My comparison category here is people who are self-identified pure independents. If we look at race, race is also important in some of these models. So in general, compared to people who would be identified as multiracial, Native American, or who self-identify racially as other, right? African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans are statistically less likely to support or to endorse the idea that police treat blacks and whites equally, right? The magnitude is different, kind of depending on the racial group. And Hispanics are less likely to support the creation of a border wall. And then if we look at other demographic characteristics, men are more likely to support the building of a border wall, and they're more likely to think that the police treat blacks and whites equally, whereas as you ascend the age category that I've constructed, you are less likely to think that police treat black and white people equally, and actually more likely to support the implementation of body cameras. So the takeaways that I have here sort of really help us understand that people who conceive of racism differently are going to have different policy preferences, and they're going to express those differently. And we see that played out all over our country, right? As people are debating public school curricula, as people are debating what to do about police reform and how much money to give to police, we need to think about what their priors are. We shouldn't assume that because most people will say that racism is bad, right? That they're actually sort of using the same term and defining it in the same way that other people are defining it. So the challenge of combating racism today is really born out of the disagreement about how much racial progress is yet to be made. But there's also this big difference in terms of the definition of racism, right? We all tend to agree that there's certain things you shouldn't do or say, but we don't necessarily always think with the nuance of thinking about how policies may disproportionately affect some people, and that might actually call those policies into question. And the reason why this is important is that if we're not going to acknowledge structural racism, people are going to be more likely to support policies that might actually be adverse to people of color. And it also means that we're actually going to delay our embracing of the beloved community. So this is really important to keep in mind. So with that, I look forward to your questions and comments.
You know exactly what to do. That's great. Thank you, both of you. And now I'd like to welcome the remainder of the panel the panelists to come up. I'd like to welcome to our panel Professors Bell and Gillespie, and then also Professors Currie Brown and Cynthia King, and Claire Whitlinger will be the moderator here, and you can stand over here. So let me introduce each of these new folks to the stage. Currie Brown, on my far left, is Professor of Sociology at Wayne State University. He earned a BA from Wayne State and an MSW and Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. His most recent book is Race and the Power of Sermons on American Politics, which examines the impact of race on the relationship between religion and social justice attitudes and political activism in the United States. His new book project examines how race and faith impact congregational involvement in grassroots social justice activism, including environmental activism. And Dr. Cynthia King, next on my left, is Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Excellence and Professor of Communication Studies at Furman University. She earned her BA and MA at Auburn University and her PhD at the University of Maryland, College Park. Race, public discourse, and media are her current research interests. And finally, our moderator, and we do have an empty seat. We had a cancellation this afternoon, so we can get the chair off there. But our moderator tonight is Claire Whitlinger, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Furman. She earned her BA at George Washington University and an MA and Ph.D. also at the University of Michigan. Her teaching and research examine the intersection between race, memory, and movements. Her most recent book is Between Remembrance and Repair, Commemorating Racial Violence in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Let's welcome our additional panelists, and I'll turn this over to Claire.
Thank you so much. I'm always really thrilled when we get to have a panel following such amazing presentations, because after all, the academic enterprise is one of conversation. So I'm really excited to be able to facilitate some of that. So I feel like my role as a moderator is to keep everyone on time, right? So we have about 25 minutes left before we're gonna end up saying goodbye to our audience. So what I'd like to do is invite Cynthia and Currie to provide some initial reactions, questions for both of our panelists, and if you could sort of combine, Cynthia, I'll ask you to go first, sort of reactions to both, and then Currie, Dr. Brown, both, and then I'll ask both of our presenters to sort of answer what pieces you're able to, and then we'll turn it to the audience. So, all right, Dr. King.
Okay, testing, can you hear me? Okay. Dr. Bell, I was so intrigued by your theory. And I think it's unique in that mostly, as you pointed out, it's people tend to approach studies, whether it's mixed methods, quantitatively with sort of themes, looking at things when they're looking at a certain population, and while it can have some dimensionality to it, it doesn't have the depth of the poetry. Your theory lends a kind of a human depth to it, and I'm excited about what it will yield in understanding populations that are dehumanized and that are politicized and that are frequently dismissed. So you bring that kind of human element, indeed the poetic element, and you use the word creativity, and you're combining some words that are normally, some words and ideas that are just normally not combined, and so I was super intrigued by that. Would you speak a little bit more about how you came to that, given your background that seems quite the opposite, and so how did you get from there to this sort of creative lens and space? Should I give you?
Yeah. Can you sort of give your thoughts on Dr. Gillespie's?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Gillespie, and I think you gave us insight into the challenges, the foundational challenges that we see sort of played out in our in political theater and in our political actions. So the idea of kind of understanding, various different perspective of racism and their implications for again how it plays out. I'm wondering, what would you suggest that we do? How might we address the disparate and the divergent views of racism, understandings of racism? How would you address, especially here at the university, and even, I guess I would even say, in our political discourse, in sort of the wider public? How might these different ideas be addressed?
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown.
Yeah, I really like the excellent and very, very powerful. Very powerful. What I was struck with Monica, the presentation is the context that led to African American mothers being in a position in which child protective services are taking their children away. And it does connect to what we talked about, perhaps the shortfall of the civil rights movement. What I was thinking about is that you have a situation access to weekend labor. And again, this is a time when African Americans are able to actually have access to unions. You have access to unions, and the unions are being weak. You have access to job allowance seniority and equal pay, and they're outsourcing and economic. And this is the advent of neoliberal policies in which they're cutting social welfare programs and education and job training programs at the same time. And sorry, I saw this really distressing study that looked at the impact of crack on African American neighborhoods. And what the study found was that if you look at the decade prior to which crack was introduced into African American neighborhoods, the murder was half what it was after. So once crack was introduced in the 80s, it doubled. The murder was double what it was during the 70s. And even in the 2000s, it's 7% higher now than it was during prior to the era in which crack was introduced. Black communities, which of course is connected to crime and incarceration, which put huge stresses on African American because what you see is that the big correlation between the biggest predictors of single parent African households, the incarceration rate. That's right, very well. Poverty goes down after 50 years. Incarceration goes up. Anyway, it's not really a question. It's very presentation when you think about the context in which African American women are in the position in which child care services are taking care. And then your presentation as well. I really think it's a one of the idea, you start off with this idea of civil rights movement because it's a victim of its success. And I was thinking about this connection between racial consciousness and interest. So for what we've been told to define as African Americans, they feel connected to African Americans, and they feel as if what happens to African Americans is very bad to me. They're more likely to support these programs we're going to talk about. One of the programs, they don't Americans, I'm sure you guys questions about workability. Is for those programs, they all do is support African Americans have higher sense of racial consciousness for policies that limit landfills and constantly. But all right, so you have that, just maps on with attitudes. But I wonder if it maps on with actual actions, so the actions in those areas. Because the way I think about it, and I'm thinking about my understanding of the civil rights movement and my own family, is that again, when we look at individuals like Reverend King or Abernathy, they were directly impacted by the issues which they were advocating for. Voting, fair housing, citizenship, they were denied those. But today, again, African Americans that are, there's an alternative African Americans that are in the middle class, these structural issues don't directly impact. I mean, by that I mean, you can afford your water. If the landfill affects the neighborhood, you can leave. Or perhaps in a community in which it would happen because it's a war zone and you're located. And I be able to cooperation and taxes that work in those communities. But again, you could feel connected to the African Americans that want to do that. You might not be involved because it's a real impact. And of course, supposed to be really impacted. You just go at least one resource, at least one time, at least one opportunity to talk to people that have. So I wonder if this issue that we're talking about in terms of victim of success is an issue of racial interest. So you have African Americans that make it to the middle class. And so, you're not going to get impacted by children, child protective services taking care of their house. Okay, that's it. That's it.
Yes. Okay, great. Right here. I'm going to do it loud. I'm not too worried about this. So thank you for those questions, and I want to be quick so we can have a little bit of conversation. So yes, the context through which the Child Protective Services or family policing system becomes impactful is totally related to all the dynamics we talked about. And one thing I want to highlight is, of course, the moral panic or epidemic of crack, and how that actually changed law around mandatory reporting. So one of the poems I did present is actually a mother talking about her the teacher she worked with and volunteered with at the school reporting her child protective services, and really reached this relationship in a powerful way. That system of mandatory reporting totally rewrote, like, if you live in an environment where, like, you're worried, maybe your house is, like, it's like, who's seeing the house? There's so much more I want to say. I want to be cognizant of time. I want to tell stories, but I'm going to stop there. I guess the one story I will tell is in order to respond to this question about how I came to try to work in the poetic method. So I'm not someone who has, like, written a lot of poetry in life. You may be able to tell that from the pieces. I'm working on it. You know, but the impulse came because I was working on a piece, and I was trying to, and this piece was drawn from the narrative of two young people. You know, I read a participatory action research study in Baltimore in 2015 after the death of Freddie Gray. And so we were interviewing all these young people, and there were two that I wanted to put in a conversation with each other, but I wasn't really able to. I felt in the context of, like, pulling out block quotes from there, like, and saying, oh, this is like an 18-year-old, you know, boy, you know, like, or whatever. Like, it was thin. Like, the ability to convey what they were concerned about was thin. And so I just woke up one morning and was like, what if I put this in, like, it's like 4 a.m. like, oh, what if I do this? And I tried it, and I felt like it was working better than the other things I had tried before. In terms of just getting through it, and I'll say quickly, the motivation is totally what you said about humanity and humanization. So when I was talking about narrative change, it's really the dehumanization of mothers who are under these circumstances. It's like, oh, of course they realize that, like, this is a very difficult situation. It's like, of course, like, someone who has been addicted to crack cocaine is like, I have to take care of my kid. Like, these are real concerns, but they don't, and so they're real concerns, and it doesn't mean to just, like, randomly oppress people. Like, these are mothers who care about their kids, you know. And so that's the motivation in that context is right. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the comments.
And thank you both for comments. I'm going to tackle them in reverse order. And so this is in part because I'm actually the teacher of my class next week. So in terms of thinking about this, I actually recorded a guest lecture today because this class for students today. And so, you know, one of the things I want to think about is in terms of thinking about who is not interested. Actually, part of Dawson's argument is that, well, actually, middle and upper class blacks are self-interested. Because, you know, of lots of reasons that would emphasize their precarity. So, I mean, you know, thinking about Massey and Denton, right? Middle class blacks have historically not lived that far from poor blacks, right? Because of residential segregation. Which means that the challenges that you see in poor black communities are actually also problems that tend to exist in middle class black communities that are, you know, geographically proximate to these communities. So, you know, as we're seeing lessening of residential segregation, like maybe there's some people who get out, but a lot of people, even if they've gotten out of the hood, for all intents and purposes, are adjacent, so they see everything. And they're still experiencing that, or you may still experience it with your family. And so there are these ways that I think people are possibly seeing this as their self-interest as well. And that's the idea of risk, that you take interest as a proxy for your own individual interests. Now, to be sure, linked bait, sort of, as a third question, is a real one that doesn't explain nearly as much as we wanted to, because most black people ascribe to some form of linked bait. And there are ways where self-interest under the right circumstances can actually end up manifesting itself over racial interests. And so this year I hired Dawson with external white and Cheryl Laird, where they talk about conditions under which you can trigger self-interest, where people kind of throw linked bait out the window, and those tend to be places where they're not being surveilled. And I think that actually does reinforce some of what Dawson talked about, because part of what Dawson said kind of promoted consciousness that is built about linked bait is the idea that blacks were in community with each other where they were getting messages that actually reinforced by identity. Right, so if you move the surveillance part of it, if you remove the social stigma, you might see blacks acting kind of independently in a self-interested way. But most blacks are living kind of in a community with other blacks where norms are still being reinforced, which is why we still see this type of behavior. So I appreciate the nuance of what Joe and Cheryl are doing. I don't think that it completely undermines what Dawson's sort of overall project is. Just provides really good context to that. And in terms of thinking about how to address racism, I think part of it is being able to call it out. We don't, and there are going to be people who resist this. We're going to, especially in this political moment, have people who still try this woke. There are people who are going to get in their feelings and talk about how you're just trying to make people feel bad about things. But I think also there are some people who have not thought about this way before. And so to point out that you have to do more to be anti-racist than just not use certain words for other people. That's the least you can do. There are other things where you think about, hey, if this continually happens and it's affecting this group more than that group, then that actually reaches questions about fundamental fairness. And you can't dismiss all of this as the culture of poverty and it's just this group being trifling and trying not to, fulfill the American dream, because black people believe in the American dream too. And black people work hard, and you have to counter those stereotypes. So I think part of it is calling it out and educating those who are actually open to being educated at this particular moment, to sort of understand what's going on. But I think it's also taking advantage of opportunities to help to explain structural racism to people who are in a position and developmentally ready to be able to understand what's going on. So I got into a discussion a few months ago with Nicole Hannah-Jones, and so there's certain things where I just wanted people to get names and dates right. But I do understand what she's talking about, that you can explain redlining, for instance, and you can make that very apparent about how that's a structural problem, and understand how that has deleterious effects on black wealth later on. So I think to the extent that you can explain it to people who are willing to listen, I think we should take the opportunity.
Thank you so much, everyone. We have time for a couple questions from the audience, so feel free to raise your hands and the things you'd like to ask. I'm seeing someone. Yes, please.
This is for Dr. Bell, and are you talking about community surveillance? And I want to know if you found any examples of community policing, or the neighborhood watch in black communities, and how they work, and whether or not maybe there was a correlation between certain associations, whether it also be churches or even just rec centers or just communities, and how that could differ side. But the main point being how maybe these community watches are different from, I guess, a typical, governmental childhood protection agency.
Yeah. So.
Microphone.
Oh, I don't know if I really need that, but okay. Well, maybe someone recording you did. Okay. Yeah. So first of all, I'm pausing a bit at the word community policing, or the term community policing, because that means 50 million different things. Well, typically when we think about community policing, we actually mean, policing by municipal police that is thought to be community informed in some way, But what I take you to mean is kind of like communities themselves.
Like neighborhood watch or something.
Yeah, neighborhood watch. So I will say, I've actually never interviewed, doing research in several cities, I've never interviewed people in a black low-income neighborhood who are involved with the neighborhood watch. And I think that, and I'll say that's of course not universal, not a universal project, but there is something, so first of all, neighborhood watches are often funded by police departments. They're very much related to the police. They're not community independent. But what I have seen a lot is what we call in sociology informal social control. That's not conducted by a neighborhood watch or by the police department, but by people in communities looking out for each other. And this is actually something I've seen in the context of family policing. So one of the poems that I did read is basically from a mother who talks about how, you know, her daughter and her daughter's girlfriend have, you know, there's some kind of, she's concerned about abuse of the kids, and like just kind of, and neglect of the kids. And she said, well, you know, I'm not gonna report them because that would be foul. And instead, you know, she says, God, and it's not God, but God said it takes a village to raise a kid. And she says, I'm one of the people in the village. So she's willing to involve herself in this situation, but not rely on these formal mechanisms of social control. And so we do see examples like that there.
Other questions?
Andra, I'd like to ask you the question of structural racism. Is any policy that has discretely resolved different racial groups by definition structural racism? Are there policies that you could conceive of that have disparate effects that would not fit that category? I always have trouble trying to figure out how one would falsify the question of is this structural racism or not?
Andra, could you repeat how you understand the question?
Sure. So Dr. Bluth's question is, if you see disparate impacts, can we always attribute it to racism, basically? Is what you're getting at. And so, you know, if I had to think of a basic example of where a disparate impact I would attribute to race, the first thing that kind of comes to mind for me would be descriptive representation, right? So we were talking about that a little bit with gerrymandering yesterday. There are Black people in places like Wyoming and Montana and Idaho. I don't expect to see African American members of Congress kind of emerge from there because the populations are so small, right? So in those places, Blacks can't be descriptively representative, in part because it's just a function of sort of people. Now, a Black person could run and win in those places, but that's not where we're going to be looking. That's not going to be where we would be focusing litigation and trying to argue Section 2 violations in the same way that we do in Alabama and Louisiana, where you see places with large Black populations that don't proportionally have a number of legislators. So like that could possibly be one example, but we can explain that and say that that's not there. The thing that we're focusing on with systemic racism oftentimes is policies that were actually intentionally created to disenfranchise Blacks that maybe got tweaked in the civil rights era, but still are doing the same thing that they did before, even though the face is neutral. Or things that were put into effect a long time ago and still have effects today. So I think like over lunch, people were asking questions about the effects of slavery. So obviously, it's been more than 150 years since slavery ended in the United States. And though I disagree with some of this research and how it's operationalized, people can actually go back and do fancy statistical models and see the disparate impacts of slavery today, right? That's structural. Because of things that happened a long time ago, there's a certain level of path dependency that's still informing kind of how we live our lives today, even though none of us was the one who did it, but we're all still disproportionately being affected by it. So there are other big structural things. Like you think about universities that were founded in an earlier era, right? That had the advantage of being, chartered, in 1700s, for instance, right? And used slave money to kind of put their stuff together, right? And then with all this appreciation, that's how you end up with fancy schools like Georgetown and Brown and all of those kinds of things. So, those are things where I'm not looking at the president of these universities today and calling them racist for it, but they're certainly benefited from those original sins. And we still haven't done enough to kind of rectify those changes. So those are the things that I'm looking at today. I'm not necessarily trying to go find racism under a rock every time. I don't see I see a little bit of disproportionality. But there's some really obvious things where we see the disproportionality, and I think it is our responsibility as academics to identify those and to educate people about why those are a problem.
I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Nelson to close this up, but I also want to invite anyone after we close, if you have questions, if you want to ask them one-on-one, I know that our panelists will be very welcome to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, panelists. As we wrap up tonight, let me remind you that Tocqueville will be hosting events next term as well. Our spring brochure will soon be available, and you are going to be amazed. We will be welcoming to campus such luminaries as Robert Putnam, David Brooks, Helen Andrews, Patrick Deneen, and Ross Douthat, among many others. You will not want to miss the spring program. Now let's show our appreciation to our speakers, and you are dismissed. I want you all to stay up here for a quick picture, and if you are going to dinner, gather around here in the front.